Right now, you are watching a New York Urban League professionals production titled Reparations, the Key to Closing the Racial Wealth Gap. My name is Mark Frazier. I am the chair of the Civics and Economic Committee. I'm also here as my co-host, Adrian Ennis, who is a member of the Civics and Economic Committee. Tonight, we are going to cover two very controversial topics, those two topics being reparations and the racial wealth gap. One can say that the two are very divisive topics, especially in the current climate of the American politics. During both the 2020 primary elections and the subsequent 2020 general election for US president, both topics were crucial talking points that never really got clear answers. Well, lucky for you tonight, those questions will be answered by guest speaker Claudio Simpkins. Claudio Simpkins graduated from McCully Honors College at City College of New York, magna cum laude, where he was named a Harry S. Truman Scholar in 2005 for his commitment to public service. Claudio received his JD from Harvard Law School in 2009. He is currently a business and securities litigator who, alongside his legal practice, has worked with New York City's at-risk youth to increase opportunity for academic and professional advancement. He volunteers with the ADOS Advocacy Foundation in both media and policy capacities. For those of you who don't know what ADOS stands for, the ADOS Advocacy Foundation, or American Descendants of Slavery Advocacy Foundation, is a grassroots organization that arose in response to a national landscape rife with yawning radicalized gaps. Locating the origins of these asymmetrical outcomes in the institution of slavery, the foundation's advocacy prioritizes reparations for the descendants of chattel slavery in the United States of America. The foundation insists upon a historic targeted allotment of policy and protections that fulfills the promise of economic inclusion and integrates the descendants of chattel slavery into the drivers of wealth. This restoration, which brings us into the alignment with the full measure of our contribution to the United States, requires mechanisms to safeguard against predatory capital and sweeping anti-discrimination legislation targeted for the protection of and accelerated wealth creation of the descendants of chattel slavery in the United States. Although our justice claim for reparations is sacred to ADOS, the foundation is fiercely committed to advocating for policies that eliminate the divides faced by Black Americans with immigrant backgrounds. The foundation recognizes the lived experience of racism and discrimination among all Black people in America and invites all people of all backgrounds to join us in this just cause. At this time, Claudio, would you like to take some time to address the audience?
Yeah, thank you. I would like by thanking both the organizers of tonight's discussion, Adrian, Mark. I really appreciate this opportunity to have a good faith discussion about closing this wealth gap. It's an imperative need. I'd like to also recognize the New York Urban League, both for the historical work that it's done towards the movement for civil rights, but even the recent work. I'm thinking of the State of Black New York report, which I'm familiar with, and the Urban League's kind of desire to its mission to connect folks with the resources to be and the support that's necessary to improve racial equality. I feel like this type of conversation tonight, this exact conversation, lines up exactly with the aims of the ADOS Advocacy Foundation. And I feel like that it's really crucial that we're able to speak about what is key to closing this wealth gap, both in New York and all around the country. So again, thank you for the opportunity. Both of you and the organization are doing really great work in being able to create space for Black folks, for allies, for Americans, for all types of folks to be able to really understand what the situation is with regard to both the wealth gap and how we might close that realistically through policy and advocacy.
Oh, sorry. Thank you very much, Claudia. So how this event is actually going to take place is that Adrian and I are going to be asking several questions of Claudio to gain further clarity about reparations. After we finish our run of questions, we will solicit the audience to give us additional questions. So please start dropping your questions in the chat, and hopefully we can get through some of them at the end of our initial question and answer segment of this actual conversation. At this time, if your microphone is not muted, excuse me, if your microphone is not muted, as I don't hear any feedback right now, please do so, and we'll start this event. So my first question for you, Claudio, is before we get into the actual conversation of reparations, I wanted to know, can you briefly explain the racial wealth gap?
Definitely. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. And forgive me in advance, I may glance down at my notes because I want to talk about some data points that really kind of illustrate this at this point. The median average for wealth for a white family in America is $171,000, while that same median net wealth for a Black family in the United States is closer to $17,000. So we're talking 10 to 1 off the bat in that very broad kind of data point that covers a lot of situations. But if we drill down, we see some more notable figures, right? So white households have about 84% of the country's wealth, 84%. Now you can compare that to Black families having 4% of the country's wealth. When you talk about these white households, the assets that they hold, white households have nearly $128 trillion in assets. This is nearly 20 times the amount of assets or the number or value of assets that the average Black household will have. In America, when we talk about the folks who have wealth, even within our Black communities, only about 5% of Black households break $350,000 of wealth. For the majority of Black folks in America, we're talking negative net wealth, because when you start to account for what constitutes the wealth of Black families, a lot of times is depreciating assets, the car, the televisions, the electronics in different ways, right? So when you account for that kind of stuff, a lot of times we're looking at net zero or net negative wealth for the bulk of Black households in America. These are Black families in the state of where they're at right now. In America, I think it's probably about 17, 18 million Black households that we're talking about. And compared to those households, white America, their top 10% has about 75% of all the wealth in the country. So this breaks down being something like Black households hold like 7 cents to 12 cents on the dollar for every dollar of wealth that white households have, right? So these numbers, there are a number of different data points that I could and I would love to share with folks, but they give the same impression, right? What I think is interesting about this question is twofold. I would like to highlight the differences between why we speak to wealth and not income. And then I want to speak to the racial aspect of the wealth gap. As far as wealth and income, wages have been stagnant in the United States for the last couple of decades, right? For the top 10%, their wages have grown by 157% in the last 40 years. But for the bottom 90% of America, their wages have only grown by about 24% over the last 40 years, right? So, income is not the thing that is going to be able to provide the economic stability today as it might have been in the past when you had jobs that provided pensions and provided security and provided guarantees and the ability to move up in a business, right? Or up in a position or organization. So that's why it's important that we understand that wealth is what provides that security. Wealth is what in 2022 is going to be kind of this deciding factor between the quality of your life in this country. And a lot of this has to do with recent economic studies by Thomas Piketty, who won a Nobel Prize in economics, and others who have kind of really shown that the gap between the folks who have wealth and the folks who have not is at the point where it can't be overcome by simple, just buckling down and working really hard and getting an education and getting that extra advanced degree and taking on that debt to be able to provide give yourself a chance at a better opportunity. Wages don't work like that anymore. It's wealth that begets further wealth in today's United States and in many other locations around the world. So the other thing I would want to briefly touch on is that I would probably phrase it as a lineage wealth gap these days before I would phrase it as a racial wealth gap, right? So in various reports by the Federal Reserve or other entities, when you really break down and disaggregate groups within races and the wealth that they might hold in different places. There's a series of studies called The Color of Wealth, which was done by the Federal Reserve in Boston, Los Angeles, Miami, different locations around the country. And they'll be able to sit there and show you that the wealth that's held by, say, African immigrant Blacks or Caribbean immigrant Blacks versus American descendants of slaves is at different levels. And even within other communities, the Chinese and the Japanese are going to have more than the Filipinos and the Laotians and stuff like that, right? So it's really useful to get an understanding that within this broad conception of what we call race, there's a lot that gets lost when you look just at the race. But if you look at the cost and you trace it back through history and you try and figure out what the originating point was of a cost that's borne by a particular group, that cost is shared in terms of Black people being on the unfortunate end of the lineage wealth gap, not because we all have the same amount of melanin or because we look the same, we got the same kinky hair. It's because we descend from those people who were enslaved. We descend from those people who were never given their fair due. We descend from those people who were plundered in this country. We descend from those people who built this country into the richest country on earth and were never given the opportunity to be economically or even politically or civically included in the population, right? So I think the racial wealth gap can be explained in a lot of different ways. But what I think is interesting is that we focus on wealth versus income, and that we understand that it's more of a lineage wealth gap that has its ties specifically in certain institutions and historical events and policies and exclusion from policies that the US government has permitted.
Thank you very much. So just as a side question to that question, so what you're saying is that we can't pull ourselves up by our bootstraps.
Yeah, for sure. I would definitely say that that is the case. If it were ever the case, it is not the case these days, right? Okay. There's no amount of banking Black, of pursuing higher education, of obtaining financial literacy, of having better family structures as per white Western ideals. There's no amount of these efforts, even when all combined, that would really be able to approach closing this lineage wealth gap. The lineage wealth gap is because there was wealth and money that was stolen and plundered and denied to us. And that's what's due. That money is still in the US economy. It's been passed down generation after generation after generation by families who are not the descendants of slaves. And it's manifested in this lineage wealth gap. So that measure in and of itself speaks volumes to how you can tie what this difference is, what these inequalities are, to the legacies of US chattel slavery.
Agreed. And so we got an idea. He was asking, a little bit about what reparations are, and as you just encompassed that it's the just due for the level of slavery and pillaging that has gone, indentured servitude and continued history of being marginalized, and now, like you said, is manifesting in a gap that we aspire to close, right? And so moving on to next question is, what reparations have been issued within the United States?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a litany of them. I mean, we can speak to Native Americans have been able to receive certain concessions. Under President Obama, there were line items for the people of Guam to receive reparations of a sort. In Alaska, in Hawaii, there have been land grants. In Alaska, there's been a program. We're all familiar with the Japanese internment victims and their ancestors being able to obtain some kind of measure of repair. Holocaust victims and the victims of anti-Semitism also have gotten their just due. What I would say is interesting about this is that in America, the folks who did receive reparations, as opposed to the descendants of US chattel slavery, are the slave owners, right? So in the 1860s in Washington, D.C., there was an edict from the federal government that said, listen, slave owners in DC, we ain't about this anymore. You've got to get rid of your slaves. You've got to free them. You've got to treat them as equals. You can't have this institution anymore. But we do understand that this will be trying times for you, right? And we know that you or your buddies are right here in Congress with us. So we're going to do you this solid. We will pay you to free your slaves that you are legally holding in bondage. against all morality, against the Constitution of this very country, we're going to pay you off. So these slave owners in Washington, D.C., in 1862, were able to get $300 per enslaved person that they set free, a total cost in excess of $930,000, which in today's money would be $25 million. $25 million the federal government put aside and said, hey, slave owners, y'all just go ahead and take that because we know times are hard for you. Yet the descendants of those same enslaved folks have never received their due. Instead, they've received the opposite. They've received violence, they've received exclusion, they've received discrimination, they've been bottom casted. And so, yeah, the United States will pay reparations, but the question is, why is there such hypocrisy? Why won't the US government pay reparations to that group that they've had enslaved since the inception of the country, that built the country into one of the most powerful, nations on earth? And that's why we see this continued lineage wealth gap, is that refusal and denial of what is owed to the descendants of slavery.
Yeah, to definitely piggyback off of that, using my background within finance, we look at time value money, and we realize that even when we are given our just due, you look at compounding and how that has a cyclical effect of us not getting it yesterday or many years ago. It still takes a toll. Even getting reparation, it's still going to be a fight for us to close that gap, knowing that someone had a head start and continue to compound on it. So, I'll let Mark go to the next question, but I had to piggyback and interject on exactly what you're saying. It is a real situation here.
Yeah, that's a great insight. I appreciate that. That's spot on.
Thank you for that. So the term 40 acres and a mule has been a part of American lexicon since about 1865. And we think of it as a reparations program or some sort of reparations program or some sort of atonement. But was that actual 40 acres and a mule considered a reparations initiative?
The language around it at the time, I don't know to what extent it was explained at that, but it was definitely intended to be a measure of repair, a reparative policy, right? So for those that don't know, 40 acres and a mule goes all the way back to Special Field Order 15, which is a Union general during the Civil War, rather, that William T. Sherman, and he endeavors to take a strip of coastal land from like North or South Carolina to Florida, to take it from the Confederates who had committed treason against the United States government because they wanted to protect the institution of slavery. They wanted to continue to enslave, our ancestors. And it says, all right, we're going to parcel this out to those ex-slaves, right? And we're going to give them the land. But not only we're going to give them the land, we're going to give them a mule, right? So the mule is important. The mule was important then, and it's important now. To the extent we talk about plugs and outlets within the ADOS community, right? The outlet is the land, but you need the plug to be able to connect your ADOS existence into economic inclusion, into full Americanhood, right? You need to be able to get the value out of the land by being given the tools and the protections and the opportunity to make the most of what you have based on your talent and your skill and your hard work and your dedication, right? But we weren't given that. So Special Field Order 15, they give some of this land out, some of these parcels out to ex-slaves. Within a couple of years, we have President Andrew Jackson, and he decides, I'm not going to protect these ex-slaves anymore. And I don't really care about, ensuring that they're given what General Sherman said that they should get at the minimum, as a beginning of a program of putting the ex-slaves in a position that they should be in following their bondage, right? So that's taken away. The Confederates immediately and quickly seize on the signaling from the federal government that this is not something that they're willing to fight over, and they just take all that land back from the ex-slaves. And what's important and significant about this is that a year later, you have the Southern Homestead Act of 1866, right? Mm-hmm. And in this situation, because a lot of folks were poor throughout the South, you had a lot of sharecropping, both from white and black families, but you know, the US government says, all right, the ex-slaves have been done dirty. We're going to give them the opportunity to buy this land throughout the South, to farm, to have for their own. And we're going to give them a head start. We're going to give them like a 6-month exclusive period to buy this land before we let any kind of former white Confederates or other white folks get in and buy this land, right? Any speculators or anything like that. But because the ex-slaves were never given the money that they lost in terms of wages for their decades and hundreds of years of free labor, right, that was stolen from them. And because they were never given the mule, right, the plug into the outlet that would enable them to actually gain something from the land they were given in limited situations. When this Homestead Act comes out, they ain't got the bread to make it happen. And even where they do have the bread, they're subject to white violence from white families that want to buy the same land. And if the land is actually arable, because most of the time, the air that they make available to the ex-slaves is terrible quality land, right? So every single way, Southern bureaucrats don't even let the ex-slaves know that this land is available for them to buy and only them to, we lose that opportunity. And ADOS existence is a series of lost or stolen opportunities that were either like that, you know, that loss of opportunity was sanctioned by or expressly affected by the US government. So that's where the 40 acres and a mule kind of derives from. But that's why I would say really like the mule is what we should focus on, because there was always a promise and a commitment and an understanding that it wasn't just recompense. It was being plugged into the avenues for opportunity. It was being plugged into economic inclusion. It was really being made a United States citizen.
Okay. Thank you.
Appreciate that very much. And so the next question right now we have is, are there any existing laws in the United States that legalize or enforce reparations?
I mean, you know, like I stated before, with regard to other groups that have received reparations, there have been federal reparations programs and initiatives before. What I think is interesting is not only are ADOS unable to obtain to date reparations from the US government, and we see these other groups within the United States receiving reparations from the US government, but the US government has been the worldwide leader in the design of reparations programs for everybody else outside of the United States. So if you talk about Holocaust or Jewish reparations, US government are the ones that leaned on the Swiss to be like, yo, run those Swiss bank accounts that got all these Jewish people's possessions and run it back to them. It was the American government that went to the French and said, yo, run all the records of all the deportations that went of Jewish people out of safety and freedom to the hands of their murderers and slaughterers on French state-sponsored railroads. Or let's find all the artwork that was stolen by the Nazis and then fenced and then moved into like legitimate art circles in throughout France, right? It's been the US government that's created that framework. So again, it's the hypocrisy is just like, yo, like not only are there local United States domestic reparations initiatives that are for every group under the sun except for ADOS, but even abroad, the United States has fashioned itself some kind of champion of morality, being able to boss other countries around and be like, yo, run these other groups their money because of what you did wrong. But meanwhile, right here in its own backyard, the United States fails and refuses to acknowledge its own original sin and make whole the group that it has made bottom cast, right? So it's like a double, triple hypocrisy. It's really like a big kind of like, what you gonna do about it to us, you know, to Black folks. So it's understanding kind of the history of reparative efforts that the US government has encouraged both domestically and abroad really highlights how offensive it is that our group are the last ones kind of sitting at the bottom saying, we've been here the longest, we built this into the richest country on earth, and y'all don't want to take care of us and pay this debt.
Thank you for that. So you mentioned earlier that in this very briefly, you mentioned that the Holocaust, you know, that was reparations. Well, after the Holocaust, it was reparations for the Jewish community. You also mentioned that there were reparations for the Japanese. In America specifically, I know that America paid that debt to the Japanese because of what was happening during World War II. Was there a reparations program for any other group in the United States?
Native Americans, there's been a whole slew of different things, both statewide and federal wide. Again, Guam as a U.S. territory, Alaska as far as its native populations. There have also been like local attempts at quote unquote reparations for the actual descendants of slaves. So in the news has been Evanston, Illinois, and a couple other places. And usually they purport to take revenue from, say, marijuana sales, legal marijuana sales, and say, okay, well, we're going to inject this money back into the community that we over policed, that we stopped and frisked, that we beat over the head, that we mass incarcerated, that we broke up their families, that we deteriorated their communities. But that's not reparations, right? Like that's what you should be doing to make these people whole. But when we speak of reparations, we're talking about a federal administered program. We're talking about something that accounts for the legacy of U.S. chattel slavery, that deals with Jim Crow. That's not a piecemeal kind of thing. So the problems with local reparations initiatives, even as far as they speak to ADOS people and Black people in America, is one, they're piecemeal, right? If you took all the state and municipal budgets all together and put them together, you'd have $3.1 trillion or so, right? Reparations is going to cost a hell of a lot more than that. So they're not even capable of addressing this problem at scale, right? The other thing is you wind up with a patchwork of solutions, right? So say Evanston says, well, we're going to take the weed money and we're going to give it to everybody, not just the descendants of slaves, and you can only use it for a housing down payment. Okay, well, that doesn't address the fact that our houses are severely devalued, the fact that our houses don't appreciate in the same way, the fact that I got to take down photos of my high yellow behind when I had the appraiser come in just so I get a fair appraisal. Because if a white person learns that I lived here, shoot, even if an Indian American or an Asian American learns that I lived here, the value of my home goes, down through the floor, right? So there you wind up with a patchwork of different solutions, and they don't really address what really needs to be done. Reparations has to be a federal effort. It just has to. The federal government is a party that's responsible. The federal government is the entity that is able to really enact and protect kind of the change that's required. It's the entity that can afford to pay. It's the entity that's been responsible for either enacting these harms or looking the other way while, society did it. There's a place for local advocacy. And I'd speak about that a little bit more later if you guys would like. But, to that extent, I would say that it's, each locality should collect information on its treatment of Black people and ADOS people throughout history. And it should submit that information to the federal government to become part of the record, justifying the federal government's tremendous, extraordinary expenditure on making Black folks, ADOS folks whole. And state and local municipalities should be submitting that information with exhortation that says, hey, listen, the only way we do this right is by a federal reparations program for the descendants of U.S. chattel slavery. And as New York City, as Milwaukee, as Tuskegee, as Mobile, as Los Angeles, as Charlotte, as Atlanta, like this is what we are supporting. And this is what we are asking of you as the federal government and as our fellow Americans.
Agreed. I actually agreed wholeheartedly. So my follow-up to that is, we know what we want them to do. What is some ways that we can hold them accountable to pushing this forward? Because as Mark has mentioned, that 40 acres and a mule has been in conversation for quite some time, right? And so how do we move from conversation to materialization? So what are some things that we can do to hold them accountable to really, say, hey, let's make this happen?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the big question is if we grant these points, if we understand the lineage wealth gap, if we understand the debt that's owed, then what then do we do? What next? And I think that's by and large what the ADOS Advocacy Foundation was created to address, that question of what do we do, right? So there has to be leadership, there has to be organization, there has to be accountability, right? The way that the Advocacy Foundation can be distinguished from a lot of the other organizations in the social justice space, as it's called today. I mean, let's talk about BLM, right? BLM was specifically created to a certain extent to be leaderless, right? As a response to either ideas that traditionally civil rights movements have been male-led and hierarchical and patriarchal. They say, okay, well, we're not going to have no leaders. Well, what you get when you have no leaders is you have no accountability and no responsibility. Where does the buck stop? Who is responsible? So as a result, you wind up with a situation, as we've recently seen in the media, where there are tens of millions of dollars that are given to support Black folks on the ground in their communities protesting over the murder, mostly of Black men, but of Black trans people, of Black LGBT, of Black women, right? And this money is going to some ambiguous BLM global fund that's backed by the Tides Foundation. So the white folks run the money. Like, who knows what's happening? Because again, there's no leadership, there's no accountability, right? So there is a need for organization, for organized political advocacy, but there has to be accountability. There has to be leadership. There have to be chains of command. There has to be discipline. There have to be processes to take grifters out of the movement. There have to be processes to take the patriarchal kind of folks out of the, just all those problematic folks, as they show their face, there needs to be processes that hold them accountable, right? But in the end, you do need that political organization. So that's what the Advocacy Foundation was created to be. That's what all of its endeavors are aimed towards, which is rolling out the capacity at the local level for people to begin to advocate for this change, to be able to advocate for a transformative Black agenda, to be able to advocate for a reparations program at the federal level. And you have to have that, because otherwise you wind up with folks who are charismatic, who are good speakers, who can hold down a Twitter space, but they're not trying to do the work. And if you're not trying to do the work, you're just talking. And we don't have the time for just talking, right? The Guardian said that Black wealth goes to zero by 2053. And that was before COVID. We're a hop, skip, and a jump away from that. And you have a lot of people that just want to run their mouth online and be personalities and maybe take some money and throw a conference or whatever. Like, you need organization, you need plans for advocacy, you need to be able to have lobbyists, you need to be able to set people up to impact electoral politics, you need to be engaged. And that's why I'm grateful for this panel, because it shows me that there is this desire and hunger within the community to understand what we do next. And and I'm able to have this opportunity to say on behalf of the organization that it's really organized advocacy that's next, with that specificity. And, we're in a season of a lot of distraction. We just had the Super Bowl. Everybody's talking about, got folks crip walking on the Super Bowl and saying, that's distraction. We got a Supreme Court battle right now. And half of the Black women that have been, put forth aren't even appearing to be down for ADOS people or Black people. So, we're being given a lot of symbolism. We're being given a lot of distraction, and that's the way it's always been. And we've always fallen for the okie doke. But if as Black people, as a community, ADOS and our Black allies, if we're able to say, no, we demand substance, we demand policy, we demand transformative policy, and we're not going to be satisfied with the symbolism, and we're not going to fall for the okie doke and get caught up in, the charade, the decadent veil, then maybe we can get somewhere. But it's going to take that organization. It's going to take that willpower. Right now, we're at a point where it's a question of willpower. How many folks are really down to do the work? So, that's why this space is really crucial.
Perfect. Thank you. That answers a lot of questions that I had in my mind. So, we talked about, what reparations is. We briefly talked about ADOS and American Descendants of Slavery and given our history in this country. Would you say that reparations should only be given to those descendants of American chattel slavery, or is it a more broad program?
I think that reparations and the Advocacy Foundation's position is that reparations are strictly for the descendants of U.S. chattel slavery, right? There is an intended transformative Black agenda because, again, as we said with the lead, there's an acknowledgement that there's discrimination, that there's persecution, that there is racism, that, especially in individual instances and employment contexts in different places where all types of Black folks in America are going to be going through it. But when we speak about reparations, this is a demand for repayment of a debt, and that debt goes back to chattel slavery, right? It goes back to all those decades and hundreds of years where our ancestors worked and had the fruits of their labor plundered from them, where they were denied their basic humanity, never mind their citizenship or their political and economic rights. And so as long as you're able to always center kind of that question of reparations for what, you're able to get to correct answer, right? The reparations are for slavery, right? The institution that built this country into the richest nation on earth, right? There is a debt to be paid for what happened with Jim Crow, with the exclusion from social programs such as the GI Bill, such as the Homestead Acts. There's all types of other costs that were incurred by this group, but it all kind of goes back to slavery and the institution of slavery. So, when you center the institution of slavery, you put yourself in a position where you can answer that question with some clarity. You say, well, naturally, the debt that is owed to the ancestors of the people whose families were enslaved in this country, who built this country on their backs and were never given a dime, and instead had everything that they ever were able to scrounge together taken from them. So that's what differentiates the Advocacy Foundation, obviously, from other groups that purport to advocate for reparations, whether it's NARC or NCOBRA, BLM in its own ways, perhaps NAACP, is the specificity. It has to be for the descendants of slavery, or it doesn't make political sense. It's just politically dead in the water otherwise, right? You see Black farmers have sued and have had a long-term ongoing fight with the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the U.S. federal government for all the things that were stolen from them, all the promises that were broken, all the times where they've been had their legs taken out from underneath them. And the federal government finally purported to do something about this, and Congress passes some kind of law, or the government or the White House passes an executive order. And the way that they phrase it so that it's any farmers that were disadvantaged had the ability to access these funds that we've set aside for specifically those farmers who have been disadvantaged. Mm-hmm. Well, when you leave it at disadvantage, what happens is you get white women farmers, you get LGBT farmers, you get white South African farmers, you get all these different farmers who came to America and they're well, I've been disadvantaged here and there. I've had some tough times. It's been difficult for me. And so you set up the program that way. And naturally, white farmers are wait a minute, how are these folks getting access to these funds and I'm not? So the white farmers end up suing. And what happens is the courts, mostly conservative, overturn that program, right? Because it wasn't specific enough to pass constitutional muster, to pass strict scrutiny, which is the standard the court applies whenever you use a race-based classification. And the program gets thrown out. And what happens? Those Black farmers, those ADOS farmers end up with nothing, because it was a failure of the government in terms of this particular policy prescription that was aimed to repair their group for the harm specifically done to them over time. The fact that you were able to use disadvantage and broaden the group wound up making it politically dead in the water, right? So if you do that with reparations, at best, I would say the folks who want to, create a broader category of reparations recipients and kind of dull down what that criteria might be to just general discrimination or hard times. What you're really doing, at best, it's pie in the sky. It's never going to float politically, but at worst, it's literally a Trojan horse that destroys any kind of real effort to get reparations. Because the Supreme Court and the rest of society is going to look at you no, we know who bore that cost. It was the descendants of slavery. All of y'all are just trying to shoehorn your way in, so we're not going to let this fly.
Okay.
So that being said, my question was, what would reparations look like? And so why I asked that particular question is that there's a lot of different rhetoric going around, whether it be a lump sum, like you said, which cash alone or land alone wasn't enough in prior situation, whether it be an annuity where people get money over time. Just based on the conversation, looking at financial literacy, you see lotto winners. When they get the lotto and they win, very few hold on to that cash. And so would it be paired with some level of financial education, or what does that look like for us? And this is to stimulate, the thoughts of the people in the audience for questions that will be coming soon as well.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, look, there are myriad ways you can set this program up. There are people who have concerns about inflation. So there, it talks about, well, you put it in a trust fund, or you disperse it at different periods in time. Do you do it as a lump sum, or different ways? What the Advocacy Foundation has advocated for has been $20 trillion as a down payment, right? So we're talking, has to be a multi-generational project of repair, because it was a multi-generational project and program of exclusion, of terrorism, of murder and plunder. So it takes a lot longer to heal from an injury that's inflicted than it does to inflict that injury, right? So in any world that where we're talking about real transformative reparations, we're talking a multi-generational project. And when we say 20 trillion is the value of the wages that were lost, right? So Thomas Kramer, an economist, he goes through, he takes the number of slaves in every single year up to 1860. He takes the wages at different years for men, women, and children from 2 cents in like 1870 to like 8 cents in 1860. And he runs it all together. And then he adds 3%, like you were talking about the compounding and the inflation and stuff like that. And he runs it up and he winds up with over $20 trillion that's owed to the descendants of slaves just for their ancestors' stolen labor. And again, that doesn't get into what was stolen in terms of intellectual property, what was lost by our inability to patent our inventions, what was taken through lynchings and terrorism, what was suffered through the exclusion and separation and segregation of Jim Crow. So it's got to be a large number, and it's an ongoing thing. It's got to be a multi-generational project, but it has to involve cash payments. There's no way it doesn't. And it has to involve protections. Like we talked about with the 40 acres and a mule. You can't just give the ex-slaves the land and then leave them to the wolves and the Confederates. And in today's age, you can't just give us our bread and leave us to the predatory capitalists. So, naturally, there's got to be that element to it. But it has to be cash payments, and it has to be multi-generational and ongoing until that lineage wealth gap is closed, and until Black folks are off the bottom.
So, the conversation has been about, I guess, what do we do next? Yes, we know that we need reparations. A lot of people think that we're not going to get reparations because we think that white supremacy will block it instantly. White people and all governmental bodies will be will have a vitriol reaction towards reparations. What could the average person do, whether they're on this call, whether they live in Frederick Douglass projects in Harlem or in the South Bronx, whether it's a 2-family household or anything, what could they do to support this movement and the idea of reparations for American descendants of slavery?
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, I appreciate this opportunity. I would say that it's really twofold, right? There's what you can do in terms of like your local politics, and there's what you can do in terms of the movement and the organization. So on the movement end and the organization, we definitely would appreciate all the help we can get. So I would direct people to join ADOS.com and, to be able to look at our reparations program and our transformative Black agenda, you can go to ADOSfoundation.org that has both of those. I would love for folks to tell their friends and family about the organization and its work, about the policy items that we are advocating for, about our advocacy, to the extent that you can afford it, to donate, to encourage your friends and family to donate. But as far as local politics and organizing, I mean, let's take New York City for an example. New York City could do with a requirement to disaggregate its data racially and lineage wise, right? When we collect data for documents such as the State of Black New York, it would be useful to be able to delineate different, subgroups of Black folks, whether it's the American descendants of slavery, whether it's those who come from, West Africa, whether it's those who come from the West Indies and the Caribbean, whether it's Black Latinos, the Dominicans and the Puerto Ricans and stuff like that. There's that is what gives us the ability to really have an accurate picture of where everybody is at and what costs have been, borne by what groups. And again, like I said, I would push local municipalities and state governments to create a historical record of what they've done to Black folks in ADOS in their jurisdiction, and to be able to submit that to the federal government with that demand that the federal government pay reparations to the descendants of slavery. That's where I would focus my local advocacy. Again, there is the Transformative Black Agenda that I would encourage everybody to look at ADOSfoundation.org, which has different subsets for different areas. So if you're in a state where there's more agriculture, there's a whole section of the Black Agenda that's on agriculture. If you're in New York City, you might be dealing with the labor section or the cannabis section, or if you're down south, you might be dealing with a voting rights section, versus if you're in Cali, you might be dealing with a climate change section. So there will be policy areas where you can go ahead and go to the organization and figure out where our advocacy is. But in the end, the reparations is what's key. That's the center and the heart of our push and our work and our advocacy. And that has to be a federal project. So locally, what you can do is push the federal government to do what they need to do.
Okay. Thank you very much for that. At this point, we are going to transition from the general Q&A that Adrian and I have been conducting over the course of this event and move to either the chat or if someone wants to raise their hand on the Zoom platform, please let us know so you can get your questions answered about reparations. I see one hand by Joshua Robertson. I'm going to attempt to unmute you. Okay, perfect. Joshua?
Hey, thank you, Mark. This has been a great presentation, and thank you so much for this information. I just wanted to highlight one thing that you had said about the farmer example, and that folks who were able to claim that they had a disadvantage, whether it be they were queer, a woman, et cetera, able to use that. I find that in our society, when we have very race-neutral policies, they further exacerbate the racial wealth gap. And I work for an organization where we are trying to close the racial wealth gap. And one example that we use is that for Black veterans during World War II, when it came to the GI Bill, and they weren't able to use it. And white veterans were able to use it to be able to buy a home, get an education, et cetera. But for Black veterans, they faced discrimination in using GI Bill. They could not attend a higher education institution, et cetera, et cetera. And I feel like a lot of times, and you kind of spoke to this, when we're race neutral, when we don't call out race, when we don't have desegregated data, and we're not intentional about race, it just furthers works to a detriment of Black people and further widens the racial wealth gap for the benefit of white folks. So I just wanted to hold that in this space, that it's important to lead with race and important to lead with Black race. But yeah, thank you so much for your comments today.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. Yeah, I appreciate that. That's spot on. That's a great observation. I mean, the GI Bill operated that way. Social Security Act operated that way. Like I said, certain of the Homestead Acts operated that way. And it's almost like there are two different kind of silos you can go down. There is the classic conservative race, color blindness. Like, I don't see race. It's like Justice John Roberts. The way to stop discriminating on the basis of race is the way to stop, is just to stop discriminating on the basis of race. It's like, nah, if you have a specifically inflicted harm on a certain group based on their lineage, then you should be able to take that lineage into consideration to repair that group. And if anything, that's kind of the limit of what is constitutionally permissible as far as using a category of race or lineage in the consideration or the construction of a policy. So, we do ourselves, give ourselves the best chance by kind of hewing to the specifics of kind of the historical harms. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of difficulty with either, aside from that color blindness, there is the class-based solution, right? So this is Kamala Harris's LIFT Act. This is canceling student debt. This is homeowner down payment assistance. This is baby bonds, right? Let's talk about student debt, right? There are many, many more white households in America than there are Black households, and many more white folks that go to college than Black folks that go to college and graduate, right? So the average white college grad has 7 times more wealth than the average Black college grad. Now, let's say we equally forgive everybody's debt. That white guy has still got 7 times more wealth than the Black guy's got. So yeah, neither one of us has to pay student debt. But first off, we don't even go to college like that because y'all used to not let us read or write. And second off, when we do go to college, we're around a bunch of y'all who are getting your grandmother's money. Your grandmother was mad at your parents for being lazy, so they skipped you and they got a trust fund, and you about to come into the great inheritance, the great wealth transfer that's about to come, right? So there are all these different ways in which a class-based solution is going to fail to account for the specific lineage or race-based harm that was inflicted. And so I'm wary of all these class-based solutions. These are the type of things you do when everybody's already equal. When you made ADOS people whole, when you made Black people whole, then you can say, now we're going to give baby bonds to everybody. Now you can say, we're going to forgive everybody's student debt. But you can't do that before you pay the debt, before you make us whole, because all you're doing is transferring money to white families who already got the money that was plundered from Black communities. So yeah, thank you. I mean, that's spot on.
No, thank you. And I was just going to mention, and I'll close it here, that when Dr. Martin Luther King was doing the Poor People's Campaign, that's when he got silenced for real, because he was being very intentional with it. But thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much for asking that question, Josh, and bringing that content to the table. Does anyone else have any questions? I don't see any hands being raised.
Everybody agrees wholeheartedly.
Exactly.
I think we touched a lot of information. Someone just asked, how do we take this information and move it forward? I know you said going to ADOS.org and touching base, but even aside from ADOS, what would you think of some ways that we can continue to push this conversation forward? I know we want to have continued conversation. This is the first of many conversations within this lane that we want to have, but conversation that we said without action is not really fruitful. And so our goal now is the closing of this is, what can we do as National Urban League, everyone that was on this call that was interested in saying, hey, how can we move this forward, getting involved and also bringing to light other people. So if each one of us can get one or two more people involved, but we want to know what that looks like before we close out.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. I mean, that's really what's important here is for us to be able to take the information that we gain here and to be able to, synthesize what we already know from our lived experience and to be able to use it to inform our next steps in terms of our course of action. What I would say as well is, there's there are political efforts afoot in all kinds of jurisdictions. I know in New York, Charles Barron has in the state legislature a reparations proposal. I know the way that it's drafted is in a more broad Black and Brown POC coalition, all those who have ever suffered, discrimination kind of way, which makes it difficult. I would say that, the work has to be done within the community in terms of creating the willpower, right? Like you said at an earlier point, there are a lot of people who don't believe this can happen. I like to think, there's two slaves on a trading block who look at each other. One of them says, man, you think this is ever going to end? And the other brother looks at him and says, nah, man, this ain't going to ever end. And yet here we are, right? So if it's not for those folks who have the political imagination, if it's not for those folks who have the courage and the willingness to step out on a limb and say, I know everybody else says that this is crazy. I know everybody else says that this is never going to happen. I know everybody else says that this is not worth it, not worth the effort. I should just go get mine. I should just make sure that my family is secure, right? I applaud all those people who are willing to look at those folks and say, nah, I don't get anywhere unless my people get somewhere, right? I don't get anywhere unless I see all my people uplifted. It takes a certain level of sacrifice, of self-sacrifice, of discipline to say, I'm not going to take the quick bag. I'm not going to go for the grift, or I'm not even going to just try and buckle down and take care of my own on the noble front without consideration of what the community needs and what's going to happen. Like I said, Black wealth is disappearing. It's kind of a now or never movement, right? This country and Black people in this country will kind of live or die by what becomes of this movement and this organization. So I would really just say kind of now is the time. It's kind of a now or never kind of time, and to keep faith alive in that, like, don't allow yourself to be kind of down, feel like that there's hopelessness or that it's not going to be able to happen. This is essential issue of our time for all Black people, right? It's now or never. This is what's got to be important. I would encourage folks not to get distracted, not by the decadent veil, not by all the glitz and glam, not by the pursuit of kind of personal accolades and success and advancement. But this is a time where we have to have the collective in mind, because either collectively we stand or collectively we fall. And that's why the organization has popped up at this time, to really make sure that there's an opportunity for those who want to be part of the work, want to be part of that community, to be able to contribute their resources, contribute their talent, contribute their desire and their hard will and their dedication in this moment to try and make something happen.
So Definitely, I know Mark is going to speak as well, but just listening to what you're saying is getting the information out there by having a collective of people who, start to get some passion behind this. And whether it be we have a list of people who can sign up and show like, hey, they're serious about moving this forward, that if we want to show Congress or show, government like, hey, look, this is something that we're serious about. And we have 100,000 people named on a list that say, hey, look, this is important to us, right? That's one way to show, solidarity behind this cause. And that 100,000 people, if we move together and we say, hey, look, let's go to ADOS and run an event like this, that's how we have that power to move forward. So that's just an idea from myself, but we're looking forward to seeing this evolve. And I'll leave it to Mark to close out.
Yes, but before we close out, I just have one more question from the audience.
Okay.
Shanice Richards asks, she states, thank you, Claudia, as we do thank you as well for being here. She says, may you please speak more on the student loans?
Okay.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, so I mentioned student loans in the context of different class-based policies. So whether it's baby bonds work the same way, I mean, sometimes these are targeted in terms of it's like, okay, if you're under a certain level of either income or something like that, then you would qualify for this. And so then they say, well, look, it disproportionately helps Black folks, as disproportionately Black folks are the people who are under this kind of level. But we know from, say, college admissions or taxes or any other number of different systems that people are able to fudge income. They're able to hide money. You pass it here, you pass it down to the grandchild so that the child doesn't have the income, but it's all still in the family. All this stuff is still passed down one hand washes the other. So like I said, there's a place for some kind of policies that are class-based, like student loan, student debt cancellation. But when you have a group that's been anchored to the bottom, right? And you provide funds for all types of different groups, and you say, well, disproportionately, the one group that's at the bottom is going to get a good chunk. There's no real way to kind of like change the positionality of folks who are at the bottom. They're going to remain at the bottom. They might not have the student loans, but they're going to still be at the bottom. They might not have the wealth, but they're still going to be at the bottom. And then there are a myriad of other problems that tie into this in terms of like, our elementary and kindergarten and middle and high schools are terrible, right? So how many of us are making it to college in a position where we're set up to succeed, right? How many of us wind up with the social capital and different things like that to be able to succeed when you get out, right? When I got out of Harvard Law School, I didn't have the mentor that I needed to say, this is how you should move, right? I had come from homelessness, from drug addicted parents, from imprisoned felon parents, from all the typical problems of ADOS to make it all the way to Harvard Law School. And then I didn't know what the heck I was doing because ADOS brothers like me don't make it to Harvard Law School. And so there was that lack of even, preparation for what would come afterwards. So how many of our folks who our best and our brightest who do make it to these levels of higher education wind up in a position where they're not really able to reap the benefits of same? If you look at the numbers as far as wealth, there are a lot of white households without a college degree that have more wealth than Black households with a college degree. You got to get to a professional degree like a JD, like I have, to even begin to approach the wealth that these white households have without a college degree. So you can forgive debt across the board, but the majority of folks that go to college are not ADOS, are not Black. And to the extent that you would forgive the debt of Black folks, and forget the debt of others, you still leave intact this wide lineage wealth gap. You still leave intact this wealth disparity. So it's something that's supposed to be in conjunction with a reparations program. It's something that should be in conjunction with that transformative change of making Black folks whole, making ADOS people whole. But by itself, it winds up being insufficient.
Thank you for that. I was just wondering, it just comes to mind, like, I forgot the theory that it's called, where it's like white people won't agree to stuff unless it benefits them.
It's Derek Bell. That's Derek Bell's, it's like the alignment of interest, right? He's like, the only time we've really seen significant change in civil rights is when you can like convince white people that their interests align with this policy that would help Black people. Interest convergence.
Yeah. So what do you say to that? Like, if you think about interest convergence, and so I'm thinking the only way we can get student loan debt and get reparations, whatever, if it's going to benefit white people somehow.
Yeah, there's a place for that in terms of our rhetoric, in terms of our argumentation. For example, Deloitte or one of these large groups has calculated the cost that the US economy incurs due to racial discrimination in employment. And it's in the trillions. So if you could turn around and tell white America and the US government that, hey, you're losing trillions just by keeping us on the bottom, if you would equip us, we would all eat a lot better. That's a way in which you can pitch the specific, the lineage specific, reparations program or repair of reparations to a group that wouldn't necessarily be the direct recipients, right? It wouldn't be white folks who are getting cash payments. It wouldn't be them who are getting necessarily the constitutional protections that should come with Black folks and ADOS folks being a constitutionally protected group as a result of this. But you can explain how this is in their interest. And there's definitely ways in which it would benefit everybody. So that's an approach as far as rhetorical, how you move forward with this. But I think even at this point, we're still at an internal conversation among Black people, right? We've got to decide if this is the path that we want to take. We've got to decide whether we're going to, maybe be distracted by the shiny things, whether we're going to follow the folks who talk slick but don't necessarily have an organizational plan, or whether we're going to roll up our sleeves and do some real work, even if it looks difficult, especially if it looks difficult, So thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. I also have one more question. I was just wondering, what's the most interesting thing that you have found? I came in late. So you work with the ADOS Foundation, right? So what are some things that you've noticed or learned, or something what's the top one or two, three things that you want us to take away from the ADOS Foundation, or just your research in general?
Yeah, I would point out two things that are specific to the org. One is that the talent and dedication levels of the people who are in the organization is through the roof. You would be blown away by the commitment that people have, the passion that people have, not being paid, putting in hours, multiple hours every single week, multiple video calls away from their family every single week, this unwavering faith that what they're doing is worth it for themselves, for their families, for their children. So one of it is a big kudos to the people who I work with at the organization, because they're all an inspiration to me, and they make me want to step up my game and make sure that I'm more on point. Two, I would say, is kind of, is attending with that is that unwavering faith. But it's just the understanding that we're not alone, that there are people that will put in the work, that there are people that are committed to this, that you're not toiling away in the soil by yourself. It's nice to have that community of folks who understand why we are where we are, to understand, that we haven't been banging our heads up against the wall for no reason, but that a lot of this has been set up by the government and society specifically for us to be at the bottom. There's a sense of community and reassurance that comes for finally understanding that, it's not that I didn't work hard enough. It's not that I wasn't smart enough. It's not that my family was dysfunctional. It's not that I don't deserve to be fully included in this country. It's that these decisions have been made for me and not in my favor, and the deck has been stacked against me and the odds are against me. So, to a certain extent, it's I want to give a big virtual hug to everybody that's here, because it's we've survived so much to even get to the point where we can sit down and have this conversation. And that's why I'm so grateful, because the org is here at the perfect time where there is this critical mass of people who are saying, listen, we see the decimation all around us. We understand that this is not our fault. We're not going to buy that lie anymore. We're ready to understand what we can do to affect change. And we understand that real change has to be in the form of these reparations at the federal level. So I would say it's really just a shout out and a testament to the talent and the dedication of the people at the org, and the hopefulness that comes from that. Because, if you would ask me 5, 6, 7 years ago about ADOS, and folks did, I was like, you got to get out of my face. That's never going to happen. But it's a credit to the people, the leadership of the org, and the people in it. So.
And thank you very much, Claudio, for that. And most importantly, thank you for coming this evening.
Yeah.
We appreciate you. We appreciate the ADOS Advocacy Foundation. And, I can hopefully speak for Adrian and myself. We are extremely appreciative for the message and the brilliance that you brought tonight. And hopefully we can work again in the future.
Of course.
And so also, too, I would like to thank Salisha Johnson for providing the initial Q&A questions They were brilliant questions as well, and hopefully everyone learned from them this evening. And we hope that we can work with you again in the future.
Yeah, thank you for this space. Thank you for your work and your dedication. Thanks to everybody who attended, for listening and being a part of this conversation. For sure, we'll be in contact and moving forward in all the ways that we can together. I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you. And everyone, please have a great night and please be safe.
Yeah, y'all be safe. Love y'all.